Welcome, everybody. My name is Caroline, and I'll be moderating and hosting this session during Monaco Ocean Week called Pioneering Seaweed Entrepreneurs Moving from Theory to Reality. During the next hour, you're going to hear from four incredibly ambitious founders who, with their teams, are busy paving the way to create a really global seaweed industry. And each is going to be focusing on a different part of the supply chain and also end markets. You'll be learning that one of the biggest kelp farms is being grown right now off the coast of Namibia. You'll be hearing that seaweed can supercharge organic farming and that kelp is replacing plastic and will soon be found in the clothes that you're wearing. So each speaker is going to be giving a short talk, and after the talk, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So please make sure that you use this Q&A time and put your questions in the discussion. Then we will have some time for the speakers to be able to answer those questions. So let's get started. Let me introduce to you the founder of Kelp Blue, Mr. Daniel Hooft. So Daniel, we've learned that seaweed farming needs to scale, and you're doing just that. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Caroline. So let me just share my screen here. So welcome and thanks, and let me tell you a little bit about Kelp Blue. So I'll tell you a bit about myself first, because this actually, I spent the first 20 years of my career living in many places around the world and working for the oil company called Shell. So being entirely engaged in how I could more efficiently and cheaply produce carbon. And now I've made this swap to doing something completely different. So how does one go from this to attempting to do this? Well, the answer lies with my wife, who one day went to a lecture with her best friend in Brisbane, Dr. Sunny Sanderson, who's pictured here during her time in Borneo, where she was studying primates. And she took my wife to a lecture by this gentleman who was talking half an hour ago, Tim Flannery. And Tim Flannery is a very well-known scientist in Australia. He used to be a mammologist, so he made his reputation first in discovering, for Western science, that is, rare tree kangaroos in Papua New Guinea and Irian Jaya. And later in life, as many scientists, became obsessed with trying to convince people who still think that climate change is like Santa Claus, that you believe in it or you don't believe in it, but to try and explain to them that climate change is something you have to understand. And his key argument over the last 5 or 10 years has been that seaweed has perhaps the largest potential in helping us mitigate climate change that there is. So this inspiration drove me to do something completely different, which is Kelp Blue. So Tim Flannery's concept in a nutshell was you take the planet, and to avoid it looking like this, you plant seaweed in vast areas on the planet, and his calculative was 4.5 times the land mass of Australia. So that would look a bit like this, with then the last half one, I guess with current politics, they'd probably want to put here. So how do you do that? Our conclusion was that the protagonist of this story should be giant kelp, and I'll come to the reasons for that in a moment. And this is giant kelp offshore Tasmania, fairly short plants here at about 12 meters, but they really form this thick rainforest with the canopy at the surface. This is a picture of Monterey Bay with the gray whales who shelter here when they're calving. And so it's this extraordinary plant that can grow up to 65 meters high at extraordinary growth rates in optimal conditions of up to 60 centimeters per day per stipe. It has very few known diseases, as long as it's not being stressed by nutrient lack or high temperatures. And it supports this vast, vast ecosystem of species from micro to macro. In CO2 removal, if we look across the scale from grasslands, which sequester about a ton per square kilometer, to tropical rainforest, which is in the same range as cultivated sugar kelp. And then, although the uncertainty range is still much larger, giant kelp forests in the wild are estimated to sequester about 7 to 8 times as much as rainforest. So if we compare conventional seaweed farming with what we're doing, conventional seaweed farming, which has been done in much the same way since the 1600s in Japan, consists of growing typically sugar kelp types on a string between buoys. And once it comes to harvest time, you come along with a boat and you lift that out of the water and you cut it manually and you bring that back. And there are a number of problems with this. The main ones being seasonality, the seasonality largely being driven by doing this in sheltered waters where temperature changes and nutrient changes are much higher. And a problem of scale. So a scale problem in the vessels, a scale problem of how you do this over many, many square kilometers, and a scale problem in terms of sheltered waters being limited by their very nature. So what Kelp Blue is doing differently is that we are growing in full offshore conditions. So we seek out places where nutrient upwelling is consistent, meaning you get constant year-round growth. We plant macrocystis, so giant kelp, which is a perennial rather than an annual species. So it has a lifespan of between 7 and 20 years, which means you don't have to repeatedly reseed the structure. Because we're harvesting only the canopy rather than cutting everything off, the CO2 sequestration and the biodiversity that we do this for continues all year round. And then essential for the scalability and the economics is that we mechanize the harvesting with vessels. And these vessels have been doing this on wild giant kelp beds offshore California and Mexico for over 100 years. So this is a well understood process. The Namibia pilot that we're planning to put in the water over the coming months looks a bit like this. So it's an extended sort of hammock structure that's entirely submerged, 400 meters long. It's about 1.5 hectares for each structure in water depths of between 60 to 150 meters. And this allows large vessels to pass over it without risk, though obviously you have the demarcation buoys to encourage them to sail around. Our vision going forward is that we have identified with mapping tools optimum areas for doing this, and our vision is by 2050 to be growing large Great Barrier Reef sized kelp forests offshore Namibia and southern Africa, New Zealand, Tasmania, Chile, Argentina, and the northern bits of the US and Canada. With that, what we hope to achieve is a gigaton scale CO2 impact, a very meaningful global biodiversity impact on the oceans, deep social impact, world-class investment returns, and last but not least, to be a lighthouse of inspiration that humanity can thrive together with nature and still be profitable. So the market pull, which I think a lot of our session today is about, is to be able to do this, we not only need to be able to grow forests at scale technically, but we also need for there to be pull from actual applications where this is required and where we can be cost competitive. So the ones we focus on initially, largely because they're the simplest in terms of processing and also the very deep markets, is biostimulants, animal fish feed additives. Then over the coming years, we will be working with partners such as some of the people you'll be hearing from in looking at everything from medical adjuvants to bioplastics, alganates produced in a more environmentally friendly way than it's done now. So these are food thickeners that you produce from kelps, textile fibers, and then last there is the human food market, which for our kind of kelp is a bit of a niche market. So that's the focus really that I'd like to have during this session to look at whether that market can be scaled as rapidly and what's required for that. So lastly, let me just thank the people who've made this available, who've made this possible. Climate Fund Managers and EOS are our investors. And on the 29th of October last year, they formalized the investment of potentially up to $60 million into the Namibian project. And without them, we certainly wouldn't be as far along as we are now. Thank you, Carolyn. That's over to you then.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel, for that brief taster of what you're trying to do with Kelp Blue. And I would like to open the floor now for questions. So if anyone that is listening has questions, please put it in the discussion. We'll have them answered. One actually just came in. And that question is, Daniel, what are the things that allowed you to pull in those investors?
Yeah, that's a great question because investors come, of course, in all sizes and colors. What's been consistent is that well, it started with the obvious first, investment grade returns. And that's something I applaud. Paul Dobbins, the sort of seaweed guru at the World Wildlife Fund US, said it very well when he said the first word in sustainability should always be profitability, because if something is not profitable, it won't last. So that's evidently something they look at first. And in that context, investors are always laser focused on markets. Are the markets that you're targeting appropriately deep for your product? Are there regulatory barriers that you've addressed? What's the price point and how could that vary? What's your branding strategy? Can you pivot? And of course, that's very relevant for the sort of volumes that we'll be looking at producing. But above and beyond all that, what really pulls investors for these types of products is the feeling that we are on the right side of history, that we are looking at tackling the challenges of business as usual, that we're looking at CO2, that we're looking at biodiversity, that what we're doing has a truly sustainable positive impact. And so for climate fund managers, which were set up very much with a climate mitigating and climate adaptation focus, that was key. For EOS Capital being a local Namibian equity investment fund, though equally interested in that aspect, of course, for them, the social impact, the job creation, the economic diversification in an area of Namibia that is that has very few economic opportunities was just as, if not more important than the biodiversity impacts.
Great. I've got another question that just came in. It said, you mentioned how kelp is sequestering carbon, but in the end, your activity is focused on harvesting it. Does that not limit the carbon sequestration impact?
So we harvest the canopy, so the top meter of a 20 high meter forest. The mechanism by which kelp forests draw down and sequester CO2 is one. So without going into too much detail, it's sloughing off of dissolved organic carbon, much as human beings continuously lose skin cells. These plants are continuously releasing dissolved organic carbon into the water. And then the particulate organic carbon, which means the fronds and leaves and bits of biomass that fall off the plant as they senesce, that go along with the currents and then get sequestered in deep ocean sediments offshore, which is the mechanism. So by harvesting about 1/10 of the biomass, you're not completely limiting the sequestration.
Perfect, thank you. And then we have another question from Pierre. Are there any negative or uncertain impacts on the environment to giant kelp farming?
Yeah, that's always a question that is involved in anything that humans do at scale, that there are always unintended consequences. At the moment, we don't foresee any major ones. There are potential concerns with what this increase in biomass in the sediments do locally. There are eventually concerns about you using nutrients that otherwise go to other parts of the ecosystem. But to put that into context, at our largest ambition in Namibia, which is hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers, you would be using about 0.2% of the nutrient supply of the Benguela current. But this is absolutely something that needs to be continuously monitored to see what kind of unexpected adverse impacts could arise.
And then following along that, we have a question from someone. Are you introducing a foreign species with all of the seaweed you want to grow around the world?
So most of the places where we're doing this, Macrocystis is endemic. Namibia, it isn't. It's endemic to the Benguela ecosystem, so it exists just south of the border in South Africa. And so dispersal monitoring shows that Macrocystis arrives in Namibia naturally very, very regularly. And the reason it doesn't thrive there in the coastal context, so right by the shore where it's shallow enough by nature, is much the same as why it peters out in the north of California and towards Oregon. The coast becomes more sandy, there's less rocky substrate for it to latch onto, and the water in itself is very sediment rich, which the small gametophytes, the spores of the giant kelp don't like. So this was obviously a major issue to look at during the environmental impact assessment, but we managed to reach a consensus that that this is a responsible thing to do.
Great. And I've got one, and I think it's an extension from the session before, but will you be building on the work done by Carlos Duarte to quantify the CO2 sequestration ability?
Absolutely. So maybe in that context, I'll show you a few things about how we intend to do that. So we want to avoid, of course, the errors of land agriculture. We want to avoid some of the unintended impacts of the early nature-based solutions, so the so-called carbon cowboys of tree afforestation. And we also want to make sure that the good work we do is maximized among other peer companies as well. So we have set up just a few days ago, in fact, formally, we've set up something called the Kelp Forest Foundation, and the purpose of this foundation is to use science, knowledge, and technology to establish in a very independent and completely transparent way the viability and value of giant kelp forestry as a nature-based solution with huge potential. And so this is something that we do primarily through academia, and tree of knowledge here I'm using to symbolize that. Carlos Duarte, we hope, will be the godfather of this program because he's the most knowledgeable person in terms of the whole way that the carbon buffering works in the oceans. So the start we're making this year is a number of young BSCs and MSCs in South Africa and Namibia. So this is Luiso and Iria and Ukarapo and Protasius, who will be starting masters and respectively PhD studies on various bits of this academic puzzle that needs to be completed to more properly quantify how the CO2 sequestration works and how you then ultimately accredit that, as well as looking at the biodiversity impacts, both positive and, as we were discussing earlier, the unintended negative ones. So there's more to that as well. There's the academia, there's the methodologies that need to be developed, there's making all those public, and then there's research expeditions that we intend to fund to send research vessels around the bits of the planet where giant kelp forests are endemic. A lot of these islands around the Antarctic drift have vast kelp forests around them. They're very difficult to access. Tristan da Cunha, for example, where we'd love to get some kelp material, is 240 people on a volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And so we intend to fund a vessel to deepen the science around giant kelp beds around the world. And for that, and that's, I think, an appropriate story for Monaco as well, is that we'd like to move from these vessels of research vessels of the past that belch out enormous amount of carbon and on average probably produce about 20,000 tons a year just for raising their own steam, to the type of research vessels that Monaco is also moving towards. So this is the Amala. It's a research vessel sponsored by I think a Saudi group together with Prince Albert of Monaco to do research in the Mediterranean. So even in Monaco, things are changing, and we do intend to be going with the wind on that project.
Fantastic. And then a lot of what you're talking about is research that needs to be done in the ocean. And can you say anything about, is there any ready ocean technology to measure this? What we're intending to do?
Yeah, there are great things happening in technology. So there are very interesting advances being made in UAVs and monitoring technologies, hyperspectral cameras that are either diver carried or carried by small drones. Putting in more sensors, tying those up. One of the most interesting things is eDNA. So with companies like Nature Metrics, where you take small samples of sediment and you can extract from that the DNA and see which creatures have lived there. And that's also essential to the carbon quantification, where as Alexander was saying in the session earlier this morning, the challenge with quantifying CO2 from giant kelp beds is that the currents can take those carbon particles for thousands of kilometers before they end in the deep ocean sediments. So how do you measure that, and how do you prove that that carbon has come from your giant kelp beds? eDNA is one of the means for that. So there are a lot of interesting, more cost-effective ways of doing this developing at the moment.
And then I've got another question that just came in. And how will you increase public awareness?
That's one of the goals of the Kelp Forest Foundation. So increasing public awareness through film, through sessions like this, through making our work public, both the engineering and the how we've fared in selective breeding. There are youth outreach programs that we're setting up in Lüderitz in Namibia, where we work with local communities, and we do intend to also publicize those. And our research vessel, I think, will make a fine subject for a film one day.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that wraps up the session with you right now.